Hello, everyone. So yes, we're talking about behavioural economics, and I think my first question of how many people know about behavioural economics has already been asked, but we'll go back to that. Where would you like me to point this? Or have you handed it over to me yet? Okay. There we go. So I'm originally from Finland and recently moved to Amsterdam, but before that, in between, I've lived in the UK for about a bit over 10 years. The reason I originally got interested in this kind of cross-cultural psychology and difference between cultures was that many years ago, at the very beginning of my career, I worked at an American company, and I was very, very, very young then, and I saw this scale being used that had 4 points as about brand, how you feel about them. You love them, you like them, you dislike them, and you hate them. And I thought that's really weird because that doesn't really translate into Finnish at all. Like we reserve the word love to people and would never use that of brands or inanimate things. And so I asked whether that's been tested elsewhere in other cultures, and the answer was no. And that's kind of got me interested in thinking about these things. That's a really good example of it's hard to know. It's hard to see what your culture, the culture that you grew up in, what that's like. A bit of a word of warning, this talk is not going to give you lots of practical tips that you can take back and apply when you get back in the office. Instead, what I'm going to try to do is to help you do a little bit better than these fish. So there's an old joke that two fish meet and one says, "How's the water?" And the other one answers, "What's water?" And just the same way, we're all a little bit of a cultural goldfish that we don't see our own culture, and that's very important to us when we're doing international market research, especially as this conference is on mainland Europe. So that's what we're going to do today. So could I have another raise of hands? How many people have heard of behavioural economics? Yay! This talk gets a lot easier every time I do it. Who thinks that they know quite well what it's about? Okay, that's quite a few hands. Fewer hands. That's good, because I still like to do a bit of an introduction at the beginning, just very quick recap, so that everyone's in the same place when we get to the cultural bits. So some people say that behavioural economics is a study of irrationality. Anyone here thinks that? Let's do a interaction at the beginning and in the middle and the end. Anyone who thinks that it's a study of irrationality? No, very quiet. Some people say that it's a study of emotion. Quite a few market research companies say that. Anyone who's kind of in that board? Or we'll leave the audience interaction for a bit later. Less and less these days, but a couple of years ago, the quite popular view was that, oh, it's just a bunch of magic tricks that are really good for parties to tell anecdotes, but you can't really do anything with it. It's like, yeah, it's very interesting, but what do we do with it? I disagree, obviously, but I'm a bit biased. I think that it's a great way to understand how people make decisions. And why do we care about this? So why is it just a fad, or why should we care about that in market research? The problem with people is that, first of all, we don't really know ourselves. So our job as market researchers is to find out what people think and how and why they make decisions. But the problem with that is that people don't know themselves. We don't know why we do the things that we do. Even if we do know, sometimes, quite often, we don't necessarily want to tell anyone why we do them because it's embarrassing or it's a bit painful. And even if we do know and we want to tell, we don't always remember. So that's what behavioural economics can help us to do. It can help us, first of all, it can navigate these issues. Firstly, it can help us de-bias our research methods, and second is that we can start to predict the bias that people might have in the purchase process. That is a whole other talk, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page when we get to this. Now, a lot of the pop science books about behavioural economics, they talk about System 1, System 2. They've mentioned today as well, about consumers being irrational. And more than anything else, what dominates a lot of the conversation is the huge number of different heuristics that are out there, heuristics and biases. If you look up on Wikipedia, there's at least 100 of them. And the question that we often face is, I mean, if you look at this, how could you possibly get your head around that? Where do you even start? How do you use this knowledge if there's a, if it's just so much stuff. Well, I have a way that I'm going to show you that could be a way to make it a bit easier and a bit more bite-sized. There are three principles that underlie all of this. They are best seen as sort of biological constraints that our brains have. The first one is that we can't possibly process all the information that the world throws at us because we just have it coming in from 5 senses all the time. So there's a limit to what we pay attention to. The second one is that we can only make decisions based on the here and now. So we find it very hard to think about, we as in human beings find it very hard to think about the future and put ourselves in our own shoes in the future. And the third one is that we can't really work out the consequence of every decision we make. If you imagine that you're just downstairs to have some lunch, if you try to figure out what is the best combination of lunch from the perspective of like how many calories does it have, will it make you full, is it ethical, depends on what matters to you, all that kind of stuff, you can't really calculate all of that. So you just basically just start acting. The best way to see those is that, see all of this, is that our minds can't do everything they need to do or everything they want to do in the best possible way, which is the ideal of a rational decision maker, that we have the unlimited time to make decisions and weigh up everything, pros and cons. That would be kind of the ideal rational way from an economist's perspective. Unfortunately, our brains just can't do it, so it's really unrealistic. So, and the way to see those, it's almost like our brains are in chains and they just can't optimize every decision in the way that we kind of should. What the biases and heuristics are is that they are sort of workarounds and side effects. So our minds have to develop workarounds around these constraints, and then biases and heuristics are side effects. It's almost like it wasn't meant to happen, but it's something that just happens as a side effect of trying to perform, trying to survive, with these biological constraints we have. Now, there's a bit of a difference of opinion in whether these biases and heuristics, whether you see them as irrationality or whether you see them as sort of design flaws, that there's something wrong with our minds, that that our mind is somehow broken. That's something that's associated with the what's called the heuristics and biases camp, which is where a lot of the books that you've seen come from. There's also another group of scholars who feel that, no, actually, that doesn't mean that our minds are broken. These are just very, very clever ways, sort of design features of our mind that help us survive in the world. And the reason for that is that we didn't actually evolve to be fully rational. That's a really unrealistic expectation. Thinking fast is actually, it's a solution that our minds came up with in the evolutionary past. The reason for that is that the brain uses up 20% of the energy for the whole body. That's quite a lot for if you're thinking about it from an evolutionary perspective. And for that reason, any operations that we can, it makes sense to try to automate them and try to make them more efficient. So if something uses up a fifth of your whole energy consumption, just try to make it as efficient as possible. Now, unfortunately, so we need these shortcuts to process information quickly enough, or otherwise what's happening to the zebra is might happen to our ancestors in the savannah. I'm actually not sure how well you see that because that's a bit dark up here. So the shortcuts are generally very, very handy. They allow us to operate in the world. They allow us to make decisions quickly, and usually they lead to quite a sensible conclusion, to sensible decisions. Most of the time we just don't notice that. It's easier to talk about, and it's more entertaining to talk about the bits or the times when our brains miss a little detail and then they lead us on the wrong path. So they help us survive in daily lives, but sometimes, for example, if you're buying a house or getting a mortgage, it does pay off to take that extra time and effort to think slowly, but most of the time we are a bit like the rabbit. This is a quick wrap-up of the intro bit. So people tend to think automatically. They use feelings and they use social cues. Our minds have certain limitations which force the mind to find strategies or heuristics and biases that are side effect to work around them. and that irrationality isn't actually the same as stupidity. We do need these mental shortcuts to be able to make good enough decisions and get through our daily lives. And actually, it does, when you look at when you look at what we have to get through, it's, when you start to think about it, being human is a lot harder than it seems at the off chance. Now, that's a lot of information I've just thrown at you, so we're going to have a little quiz. So if you've got a pen and paper, or you can make a note on your laptops as well, or your phones. I'll just let you get pen and paper. First question. True or false? A language can have no words for left and right, have no word for the colour blue, and have an impact on your wealth. And a bonus question, is it possible for a language to have no equivalent for the word please? Just true or false? All good? Second, ooh, back. True or false? Yeah, 4 times true. No, as in for each one, true or false. So A, B, C, and D, and then tick, cross, tick, cross. Okay. We all good? Yeah. Yay. Which one is longer, A or B? No, write down. Quietly, we work quietly. And the third one is, would you personally rather have 2,500 euros now, and by the way, this is not an offer, or 2,800 next month? Yes, it's a quiz. So, well, this one is your opinion. Which one would you rather personally? Well, in your personal life, in your personal life, say. Your personal life context. I'll put the caveats next time I do this, and just, you know, the conditions. Right. So we've had a look at general principles of decision making and so on. But what I'm really interested in is that, okay, so we've kind of gathered that maybe people aren't that irrational, maybe they are, but how does that work in different cultural contexts? Because I just don't think that we're necessarily all the same. There are actually 3 aspects to every decision that we make. So there's the decision maker, that's every single one of you. There's the choice context, and then there's a choice task. Now, most of the literature that you've probably ever seen on behavioral economics focuses on the 2 of these 3. Choice context would be something like, how do you frame a choice? Is it, you know, something 90% fat-free or 10% fat? And choice task, sorry, the other way around. Sorry, choice task is like, what is it you're choosing between? And choice context is the aspects like putting time pressure on people, cognitive load, and so on. And actually, a lot of market research companies have started to incorporate the finding, you know, this type of literature into their knowledge into their research. But one thing that is still being ignored is the decision maker. There are a lot of differences that on the individual level that can affect our decisions. For example, our age, our gender, and also, obviously, for the sake of this talk, the cultural context that you grew up in. Now, that's made even more sort of complicated by the fact that 95% of the world's psychology research is based on just 15% of the population, and actually 70% of all psychology research is done on Americans. So an American undergraduate has 300 times more likely to be the subject of a psychological experiment or psychological research than anyone else on the planet. So that's a little bit biased, as I would say. So most of the psychology is pretty weird. So it's done on Western and educated samples in rich and industrialized and democratic countries, which is not all of the world, obviously. Good thing is that the academia is actually following suit and is kind of doing something to improve this. Many of you might know Dan Ariely or heard his name. So this is what he says, that one of the biggest challenges in the academic field in the next 10 years is to understand just how general the findings that we have now, how do they apply in different cultural contexts. Some people would go even further and say that every behavioral economics effect we know is weird. Now, the truth is probably somewhere, is probably more of a compromise, and it all depends on your perspective, but the reality is that there's still a lot we don't know. Instead of just telling you that there are, that these people, these wise, clever people think that, I think I'll try to convince you of a couple of bit more basic things than the heuristics and biases we're used to, and do a little whistle-stop tour around the world. So it's time to exercise. Unfortunately, I have more audience interaction. So would you please all stand up? It won't be jumping or anything like that. I don't like doing that. So first of all is go south. Okay. Then it's lift your northern hand. And then finally turn to the western side of the stage. Okay, I'll have mercy on you. You can sit down. So the reason I made you do all that is to kind of have a look at, can language impact the way we see the world? I could kind of tell that most of you found those instructions pretty confusing. They would be to us, but for these two tribes in Northern Australia, that's how they communicate. They don't actually have words for left and right. It's like there's an ant on your northwest leg, or could you move that cup to the west? And that's pretty odd from our perspective, but that's how they navigate the world. It's not just language as well. They've done experiments where they've taken some members of the tribe, not in a forceful way, just in or in all collaboration, taken them to a place that they don't know, and then asked them to kind of say where, point out where different cardinal directions are, and they will know. They will just know which way is west and north and so on. But when you take English speakers, they have no clue. So what that and other experiments show is that for them to be able to navigate the world, they are constantly monitoring where everything is. That is how they process their visual world and their spatial world. The difference between the two is that we see the world as from an egocentric perspective, so everything is to my left or right. I am the reference point, whereas for them, the reference points are all around them and not in themselves. By the way, go south means bend over. There were some other pictures that I could have chosen, but I thought that was a bit more appropriate for the conference. And then the other thing, it's not just about space, but let's have a look at whether language can determine what colors we see. Some people would say that surely how our perception is something that is universal. We all see the world, like that what input into the eyes and how we see something at that basic is the same and is universal. Now, there's a tribe in New Mexico that only has a word of orange, so they can't really differentiate between yellow and orange because it's all just covered by the word orange, or their version of it, obviously. I chose to put the translation and not the word, just to save the pronunciation. In Vietnam, there's also, in Vietnamese, there's just a word for gru, so green and blue. And they also find it harder to differentiate between those colors in an experiment because that's not how they're used to encoding the world. And conversely, the other way around, in Russian, you have two words separate words for dark and light blue. And if you ask Russian speakers versus English speakers to try to categorize the color in the middle into the whatever you call that, like a spectrum at the top, Russian speakers do that faster than English speakers. And that's because they're used to encoding the color in a different way, simply because they have a word for it. Now, that's color, that's space. Now, how about how we perceive time? I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there will be speakers of different languages in the room. You can roughly split languages into two groups, at least European ones. So you've got those who keep present and future highly separate. So, for example, English, Spanish, and French. And then some other ones that have present and future is less separate. One of those is Finnish, Dutch is another one, German, yet more. And the example of that is that in the highly separate one, it'll rain tomorrow, or it rains tomorrow, or it rains today. You'll probably recognize that if you were speaking any of those languages. What that means is that similar to the color, where you have to kind of encode it in a different way, some of us, depending on what language we speak, we have to remember the difference between, or pay attention to the difference between present and future more than others. And that difference in what language we speak and how much we pay attention to the present and the future, it actually affects our willingness to make trade-offs in the present to benefit the future. It's probably not worth looking at all the little details in there, but what that is savings rates in a whole range of countries. The light bar ones are the ones that have less separation between future and present, and the darker ones are the ones that have a more strict no separation. There are, of course, other factors that influence that, and if you plot that into actual bit more detailed statistical analysis, you'll see that it holds, but that's easier to show. Right, some results. So I might just reveal them, and I'll see from your noises that you make whether you got it right or wrong. So we could probably see that there are languages that have no words for right or left or right. There are also languages that have no word for a color blue, can have an impact on your wealth. And bonus question, does anyone want to volunteer? True or false? True. Yes, that's right. That will be my native language, Finnish. It's one of the hardest things to learn when you move abroad, is to constantly learn to say please, otherwise you sound rude. So, which one is longer? That actually depends where you live. This is just to show you the kind of the extreme answer of this. There's a lot more research on this as well. Whether you say A or B, it depends where you live. So the original studies where this was deemed as a visual illusion was done in America. So you'll see Evanston, Illinois at the right-hand side. And then you've got, at the other end, you've got a tribe in the Kalahari Desert, the San, for whom it's not really an illusion at all. And what the research suggests is that people grow up in different environments, and the sort of, what's the word? The sort of how much geographical, sorry, I'm not a native English speaker, and sometimes I forget the word and get like Finnish words in my head. It depends if you live in if you grow up in an urban environment or in a rural environment. Before we move on, I just want to leave with you a quick definition of culture. The way I look at culture can be used like consumer culture, it could be, Harley Davidson, owner culture, whatever. In this talk, and the way that I see it, culture is like your filter for the world, the glasses that you put on because of where you grew up. And it's a way of interpreting the world based on where you grew up, and in a similar way to a lot of people that you grew up in. Not everyone is the same. It's not entirely homogeneous, but there are broad patterns of where you grew up that will influence how you think. Another way of looking at it is that when we navigate through the world, we learn these rules of how to deal with with reoccurring problems. And so even though quite a lot of the time the destination that we want to get to is the same, it might be, say, finding a partner, it might be going about a career, or these are like the big life problems. Even though the destination is the same, there are lots of different roads that we can take there, and these different roads that we learn, that's basically, they're often different. How we make decisions, it's affected by a lot of things, which is why it's very hard to have sort of hard and fast rules of like, okay, you're from that culture, and you're from that other one, and this is how you behave, and that's how these other people behave. It's, for example, things like ecology. It can influence a culture or the way that we behave. If you grow up in a sunny, warm climate, it's more likely that it's typical to socialize with people outside. However, if you're from a cold country, like the Netherlands, or even further up in Finland, you socialize indoors and don't really want to leave the house for half the year. So that can also affect cultural norms in a particular way. There are lots and lots of different things that can come into that. For example, pace of life, then also things like history and the politics in a particular country. So a lot of these things can influence it. And also, for example, East Germany and West Germany are, in some studies, they've shown that people think differently. So even on that small level. And all of these things, they can make the bias and heuristics that you'll read about in these books, they can make them work differently in different countries. Quick wrap up, because there's a lot of stuff that we're going through. Most of what we know about human decision making is actually based on a very, very small slice of humanity, mostly from Western countries. And then cultural context can have a really powerful influence on our thinking, from just about ranging from anything from color, time, space, and money. And then lots of different things in the cultural context also influence our decision making, and sometimes in unexpected ways. Now that was our whistle-stop tour, but this talk is about behavioral economics, so let's get back to that. So all the color stuff is fun, but it's not really what we're here to talk about. Why we need to talk about culture and cross-cultural psychology in the context of behavioral economics is that there's been a lot of interest in behavioral economics over the past 4 or 5 years, and that puts a lot of pressure on practitioners to apply this science. But as we've seen, there's very little scientific research available in cultural context outside US and in some cases Europe, but it's quite limited. And a question I often get is like, well, why is that? Well, we would probably all agree that there are differences in values and attitudes and manners and etiquette. Like you've probably seen lots of books on this as well. That's called cognitive content. And psychologists would have broadly agreed that, yes, there are differences in the cognitive content, but we think that the cognitive processes, as in how we make decisions and how we, for example, see color, that they are largely the same. That's known as a sort of a universalist assumption, that we are all, deep down, we're kind of the same. So we'll come back to this question. So who would rather have 2,500 now? Okay. And the rest of you? Or is it just checking? I know it's obviously one minus the other, but just seeing how many of you are abstaining. Well, that actually depends where you live. I asked the same question of a Ghanaian taxi driver a couple of years ago, and he was like, of course I want the money right now. Who knows what's going to happen next, being in Ghana. But obviously that is again influenced by the, you know, as I said, economic and social environments that people live. So if you take a study where they looked at this and they've grouped the countries, so the first one you've got Germanic and Nordic, next one is the Anglo-Saxon countries, and then you've got Latin Europe at the end. So it turns out that we're all quite impatient, but some people are just more impatient than others. And it doesn't surprise me at all that you look, you know, coming from a Nordic country and then living here as well now. So yeah, there are some differences. I'm not going to go into the details of all these examples, but I just wanted to show you that it's not just academic experiments that where the cultural differences are really, really important and come about. These are some trials that the Behavioural Insights team in the UK is now a separate company, and they've helped other governments do trials on how to get people to pay tax more, and turns out that different things work in different places. So in the UK, you appeal to social norms, like, you know, 9 out of 10 people pay their taxes on time. You're not. And then in Guatemala, doesn't work at all. It's basically appeal to national pride, and it's like the state is watching you, you should do it. And in Israel, basically, any moral appeals that, you know, be a good person, doesn't make a difference. You just have to threaten people to do it. So it does have a lot of practical implications at why we need to be aware of all this. So there's a lot of interest in these applications, as we can see, but very, very little research. There are some findings at little specific areas, like maybe this tax trial, maybe there's, you know, the hyperbolic discounting example of how much, whether you'd have money now or later, but it's very hard to sort of generalize and take that into other areas. And the reason for that is that there isn't really, so far, a guiding framework for those scientists who work in a behavioral, not behavioral sciences, but decision-making psychology and behavioral economics. There isn't an agreed framework to get hypotheses from and to kind of decide on what we're actually going to study and what is it, how does it all link together. And that makes it even harder for practitioners to apply this. So, While we wait for decision science to catch up, it can take a good decade or two, I've got some tips for you that we can use along the way. Now, I've taken, some of you might be familiar with Gert Hofstede's stuff. Yep, quite a lot of nodding. Good. I thought this would be a familiar example for people. Now, it has its problems, but it's a good starting point because it's kind of a handy big taxonomy. Also, he has a website that you can just check any country that he has data on, which is quite a lot. So it makes it easier to use as a starting point. Now, that's incredibly messy, obviously. So I've made it a little bit simpler, but what we can see is that European countries are not all the same. US is there as a little benchmark since a lot of the research is being done there. To make sense of that, I've kind of grouped a couple of those countries. So I've put the Anglo-Saxon countries together because they were quite similar. Then you've got Europe, or the European countries in the previous slide, excluding UK, and then China, because a lot of the research that has been done comparing the US with another country has been with China or some with Japan. So what you can see is that they're actually often China and the Anglo-Saxon countries are at the opposite ends. But that doesn't really help us because we're in Europe and we're not, unless you're doing research in China, that's helpful. But quite a lot of the time there are more subtle differences, and Europe is somewhere in the middle in different ways. So I'm going to take one aspect of it, one dimension, just to drill down into that and show you some examples. But there's a lot more in this area. And we're going to have a look at what consequences this one dimension could have on our behavior. Individualism and collectivism are sort of terms that you should use to refer to society level, so to specific cultures, but not to people themselves. On an individual level, like human beings, you can generalize that, in individualistic countries, people tend to focus on themselves more than anything else. They prioritize personal needs and their goals, and by and large, they want to, deep down, they want to be unique and different. What that brings about is an independent view of the self. That's the term that you can refer to on a personal level, how you can measure that. So, in a nutshell, the independent self, although other people's views matter, personal preferences usually guide our choices more than anything else. Now, that seems really obvious to most people in this room, I think. And it did to me until I had, for example, I had a Japanese friend, and I learned a lot about how you can see the world completely differently. So the opposite of that, or the other end of the spectrum, is collectivistic countries where connected to others, or being connected to others is a priority over yourself. What's really important is maintaining relationships and having a fulfilling social life, social roles. It doesn't mean that we don't find relationships important. It's just a level of priority that goes above and beyond your own needs. And quite interestingly, norms, or what is acceptable, what other people in a society would want, that's not separate to what you want, what your preference is as a person. It's something that you've automatically integrated into what you want. It's very hard to sort of, for a Westerner to understand that. I've had it explained to me many, many times on a personal level by friends, and it's still like, ooh, but that seems so weird. I can't feel it. And so, yeah, that brings about an interdependent self where social norms and other people's expectations are a stronger influence than what you want as a person. Put it another way, this is obviously an exaggeration or like a stereotypical, that in the West you might have a mum asking a daughter, what would you like to wear? And she wants to be different. And then while that's a Japanese mum, it's like, what are other people buying? And I want that dress that everyone else is buying. I've got a little video for you that brings that to life. Sound?
For stuff? Other countries, they work, they stroll home, they stop by the cafe, they take August off. Off. Why aren't you like that? Why aren't we like that? Because we're crazy, driven, hard-working believers, that's why. Those other countries think we're nuts. Whatever. Were the Wright brothers insane? Bill Gates, Les Paul, Ali. Were we nuts when we pointed to the moon? That's right. We went up there, and you know what we got? Bored. So we left. Got a car up there, left the keys in it. Do you know why? Because we're the only ones going back up there, that's why. But I digress. It's pretty simple. You work hard, you create your own luck, and you gotta believe anything is possible. As for all the stuff, that's the upside of only taking 2 weeks off in August. N'est-ce pas?
There are two of them, and they're all in one. Do you want to go back? Yeah. Okay.
Why do we work so hard?
It's somewhere in like 1 minute, because it is 2 minutes. There you go.
We're not supermodels. We're trying our best to be role models.
Get out of the car, here we go.
We don't jump at the sound of the opening bell
Max, buddy.
because we're trying to make the school bell.
This is the place.
Corner booth beats corner office any day. We're more into being a partner than making a partner. We make the most of our time and our money. Introducing the new fuel-efficient 2014 Malibu, the car for the richest guys on Earth.
So, forward. Have you given it back to me? Yes. So I'm hoping that you can see that there are two very different types of appeals going on there. The Cadillac man is, they are talking to someone, to a person with an independent self, that you're individual, you're unique, you're influencing people, you're making things happen, and you're free to do anything you want. Whereas, and these are both from America, so you can have this within a cultural context as well. The other one, the Chevrolet ad, is more about the interdependent self. It's all about the relationships. It's all about adjusting to other people. Like the man gave his phone away because they're having dinner, and it's adjusting to other people's needs. And it's very much sort of all about, it's more important to be a partner rather than making partner. So very different types of appeals. Now, these different types of cells, the point of the conversation here, or the talk here, is cross-cultural, but these are also prevalent inside cultures. These clashes, these different cells you can see them everywhere. The independent cells, you tend to find them in Western countries. They tend to be, men are more independent. They'll tend to have independent cells rather than women, and so on. So we can see these probably inside Europe. It's not just US and the rest of the world, but they are everywhere. The question is, how do we get this way? And I know that I've got a timer here. So we get this way because the society that we grew up in makes us that way. The self-concept acts as our lens, as our filter for the world, or the attention that the attention we pay to different things. It organizes the information in a way that is relevant to us, and it helps us make sense of the world. I'll show you two examples of where that makes a difference in the behavioral economics context. One is a very sort of marketing universal that people use price as a proxy for quality. Now, for the independent self and everything else is separate. Price, therefore, also price is evaluated differently from everything else. But for an interdependent self, everything is connected. It comes with, even though I haven't shown you an example of it, interdependent cells tend to come with a way of thinking that everything is related to each other, even not just people, but concepts and things as well. So price is really tightly weaved to all the other product attributes. And what you can see in experiments is that price is actually a much stronger cue for quality in a country where interdependent cells tend to be dominant. So that's something to think about if you're doing research in a non-Western context. Another one is an endowment effect, which means that when we own something, we tend to value it more than if we didn't. Or once we own it, we value it more. Same kind of thing. So for an independent self, enhancing yourself, the self is central to everything. So of course, if I own it and I'm really good and I'm really unique and special, then the object is also really special. But for an interdependent self, enhancing your own, your uniqueness is less important. And actually, what you can see in experiments is that you get a much weaker endowment effect in the non-Western countries. That's not really all. There's a bunch of stuff around the biases and heuristics. But thinking about it a bit more broadly from a market research perspective, everything we currently know about marketing phenomena, and therefore our research methods as well, they've all been built on this Western idea of an independent self. So just think about if you've done a marketing degree, just remember, think about where those books came from. Most of them would have come from America. A lot of the methods that we use, for everything from surveys to focus groups, most of them have been originally developed in America. And also all the concepts that we tend to measure, let alone the way they measure it. Things like persuasion, satisfaction, and loyalty, they're all based on an assumption that we need to understand someone's personal preferences. But what if that isn't the case? Now, I don't have an answer to that, and I don't think we will have answers to all of these questions in the next couple of years. It's going to take some time, and it's quite a big thing to look into. But the first thing that is important is to be aware of that. So, like those two goldfish, it's so easy to forget that what surrounds you is normal, but it's only normal because it's the only thing you know, or it's what you happen to know. Something I'm learning very quickly, having moved just 50-minute flight away from London. There are a lot of things that I'm unlearning personally. So the principles, these are a couple of the key thoughts I want to leave with you. So the principles of decision-making are probably universal, but cultural context dial them up and down. The way that the culture that we grew up in, it's like our window to the world. We think that everyone sees the same way, but actually, depending on what window you're looking through, you might be seeing completely different scenery. These mental models that we've grown up with and we've actually built for ourselves, they give us these default assumptions about people that we interact with, how we interact with them, and how to react to any situations that we face. But it's really, really important to remember that just because someone has a different mental model, it doesn't mean that it's worse or it's less efficient. It's just different. What behavioral economics can do is that it can give you a roadmap to understand the different mental models that consumers have. If we have this kind of explicit framework, we can identify different factors that matter in decision making. If we don't, we're just relying on intuition, and that could be quite hit and miss. But if we want to apply behavioral economics effectively in different cultural contexts, and not just in the US, we genuinely need to be aware of all the cultural factors, or all the factors that can influence decision making, not just ignore all of that. So what that means is that we need to localize this knowledge when we're applying behavioral economics and translate it all into the specific context, consumer decision making context we are in. And finally, the thought I want to leave with you is that something that looks globally irrational could actually be locally rational. Thank you.
Thank you.